Welcome once again to the Ahern Video Podcast. Today I want to discuss the trucking industry. The title this week is basically to be proud for our industry. Be proud that you're part of our industry. Recently I did a podcast and I also did a newsletter, and it was picked up by Fleet Owner. And in the article I said, stand up for yourself, stand up for the trucking industry. And I took a very aggressive approach to our industry. Everything that you can think of at some point in time is delivered by a truck. Medical supplies, food, clothing, shelters, the necessity of life. Without a truck moving those products, we would lose our existence. And yet we are the most crucified industry in the country. We're not appreciated. There's a preconception that we're a bunch of rednecks that take drugs and drink alcohol. And they don't realize that the trucking industry is one of the safest industries in the country. It's a highly regulated industry. For drivers, it's a very difficult industry. And let me give you some examples. This year was the worst winter I have personally seen in 40 years. Can you imagine getting in a truck in Green Bay, Wisconsin at 50 below zero and delivering products cross-country in this kind of weather? Yet the truckers did it. Yet the truckers got the goods there. Can you imagine that the people that had power failures on the East Coast, if the propane wasn't delivered in this terrible, terrible weather, what would have happened to those individuals? Some of them would have frozen. Yet that propane driver, that heating and oil driver, he got the product under less than desirable conditions. You got to stop and think that at some point in time you have to stand up for what you believe in. You have to stop and think at some point in time that we as an industry have to bond together, and we have to get the word out that we are not this atypical vision of who you think we are. Trucking industry is as middle America as you're going to get. It's made up of families that want to better their lifestyle. It's made up of people that make many sacrifices for their families so that the general public can live a more comfortable lifestyle. I was recently attending a function, and there were a group of attorneys were there, so that tells you what kind of function it is. But it's interesting. I'm standing off talking to a friend of mine, and I hear one of these attorneys say, yeah, well, this dumb and I honked my horn at him, and I did this and I did that. But I had heard him say about 10 minutes beforehand that one of his children was in a serious accident, and this hospital was the best because they saved the kid's life. They had the instruments there, they had the blood plasma there, and so he was very grateful. So I listened, the rambling, and then I finally went up to him. I said, "Excuse me, but I'm in the trucking industry." And the first words out of my mouth, well, shame on you. And I said, well, let's look at it this way. I just heard you talk about your children. Your children are sacred to you? Yes. So the blood plasma was there? Yes. They were rushed to the hospital? Yes. The surgical instruments were there? Yes. Well, how do you think they got there? There's dead silence. What do you mean? How do you think the blood plasma got there? It's delivered by a truck. How do you think the surgical instruments got there? It's delivered by a truck. An ambulance is some form of trucking. Therefore, all ambulance drivers must be as all other truckers. Is that correct? And what I was trying to do is get him to think. And then I opened up his mind. He said, I never thought about it that way. I said, would you believe that statistically, 87 to 89% of the time that a truck's in an accident, it's not the trucker's fault? I didn't know that. Of course you didn't know that. Do you know that there's 33 to 36,000 private passenger fatalities every year? No, I didn't know that. Do you know that if you have 1 or 2 DUIs, you can still get behind a truck? You can still get behind a car and drive? I didn't know that. Do you know that if that was a trucker, he would lose his license, he would lose his ability to defend, to provide for his family? And what I realized at that point in time is that there's an education process that needs to take place. And until we bind together and we get that information out there. I mean, I don't know if you saw about 3 weeks ago in the state of California, there was maybe it's 4 weeks ago, it was a settlement that happened a couple years ago. A family was driving, they swerved around to avoid an accident. There was a truck parked on the side of the road in the emergency area. The car, private passenger vehicle, ran into the car. The jury ran into the truck. The jury awarded him $150 million to the family. The truck was parked. Think about that. The truck was parked. And then I realized it's not about the accident, it's about emotion. We have to learn how to deal with emotion. Listen, anytime there is a life lost, it's a tragedy. But I think what happens in the trucking industry, it's sensationalized. And the reality of the situation is anytime you lose a loved one, it's terrible. But at the same time, you cannot blackball an entire industry for some very negligible people in that industry. Do we still have to police our industry? Yes. Do we still have to do more things? Yes. But if you look at it realistically, why do we let people that have had 2 DUIs continue to drive a vehicle? Why do we let people that have 5 or 6 accidents continue to drive a vehicle? Why don't we have tougher laws for private passenger vehicles which substantially outnumber trucks? And the answer is because of the general public's perception. So I want to leave you with this thought. If you've ever been in a circumstance where you needed something and it was there, it was delivered by a truck. If you've ever had a child that's been injured and that child has had a remarkable recovery, it's been delivered by some form of transportation. And that's the point I'm making. Until next time, thank you for attending the podcast.